Easter Sunday, March 28th, 845 AD. Dawn had barely broken over Paris. The city was peaceful. Churches were full. Prayers were being spoken. The most important day in the Christian calendar had begun. Then the church bell began to ring, differently than expected. Once, twice, then again. And it didn't stop. People looked up. Heads turned. The sound echoed across the island, across the bridges, across the waters of the Seine. Something was wrong. People poured out of churches. They climbed walls. They rushed toward the river. And what they saw should have been impossible. At first, it was just vague shapes in the morning mist, dark silhouettes moving on the water, slowly emerging one after another, until there were too many to count. 120 ships, 5,000 men, already there, already inside the kingdom, already at the gates of Paris. The alarm bell wasn't warning that an attack was coming. The attack had arrived. Not on the border, not on the coast, in Paris. By the end of that day, Paris had fallen, and the king of the most powerful kingdom in Western Europe sat down and paid them to leave. An unimaginable amount of gold and silver, just to make them go. And when I say unimaginable, we'll come back to that. But that's not the most surprising part. The most surprising part is that they made the impossible possible. A fleet of 120 ships, hundreds of kilometers inland, outside the walls of Paris. And nobody thought it could be done. Which raises a question. How does a fleet of 120 ships sail hundreds of kilometers into the most powerful kingdom in Western Europe, and nobody stops them? How does a city protected by water on all sides fall in a single day? The Frankish chronicles call the leader of the fleet Ragnar. You might know another name, Ragnar Lothbrok. If you've watched the TV series Vikings, you've already seen a version of this story. Whether Ragnar and Ragnar were actually the same man, nobody knows. The sagas were written centuries later, and the evidence is frustratingly incomplete. But in a way, it doesn't matter, because whether his name was Ragnar, or something else entirely, the question isn't what his name was. The question is how he did it. Because this attack didn't begin on Easter Sunday. It may have begun decades earlier. When I say Paris, you're probably imagining the city we know today. But the Paris of 845 looked nothing like that. Most of the city was confined to a small island in the Seine. Today it's called Ile de la Cité. Back then it was Paris. And it was no coincidence that the city was built there. The island gave Paris something every medieval city wanted: time and control. Any attacker had to cross water. Any army had to funnel through a handful of controlled crossings. And if danger was coming, people expected to know about it long before it arrived. Paris sat deep inside the kingdom, protected by distance, protected by the river, protected by everything people thought they knew about how war worked. Which is why what happened next felt almost impossible. The Vikings didn't attack Paris despite the river. They attacked Paris because of it. The river had always been the city's greatest defense. The Vikings looked at the same river and saw a path. But seeing the path and traveling it were two different things. You see, Paris was more than 300 kilometers inland, upstream, against the current. And the further inland they traveled, the more challenges they would face. How do you move a fleet that far from the sea? How do you feed thousands of men? How do you navigate unfamiliar waters? How do you avoid becoming trapped deep inside enemy territory? And perhaps the biggest question of all, how do you get back out again? To the Franks, these weren't small obstacles. They were the reason nobody thought an attack like this could happen in the first place. Which raises a question. How did the Vikings solve them? Most people imagine Viking ships as primitive, but in many ways, they were built around a completely different philosophy. A ship crossing the open ocean needed to be sturdy, heavy, stable. The kind of vessel that could carry supplies, cargo, and provide protection from the sea. Those things made a ship safer, but they also made it heavier, deeper, less flexible. The Vikings made a different choice. They were willing to sacrifice comfort, willing to sacrifice shelter, willing to sacrifice cargo space. In exchange, they gained something far more valuable: mobility. Their ships were light, fast, shallow enough to travel rivers, strong enough to cross oceans, and light enough that a crew could drag them across land if necessary. Dragging ships on land is called portaging, the same vessel that crossed. The North Sea could be pulled onto a riverbank, carried around an obstacle, launched again, and continue its journey. To most people, that sounded absurd. To the Vikings, it was normal. And perhaps that's the real secret. What made the Vikings so dangerous wasn't the ship itself. It was their willingness to do and endure things others wouldn't. The Longship simply made that possible. It wasn't built to make life comfortable. It was built to make the impossible possible. But even the perfect ship couldn't solve every problem. The men still needed food, thousands of them, day after day. The answer was simple. The expedition fed itself. As the fleet moved inland, it raided, gathering food, gathering wealth, gathering information. Paris wasn't the first place the Vikings attacked. Places like Rouen had already felt their presence. Every stop provided supplies. Every stop provided intelligence. And every stop taught them something about the kingdom ahead. What looks like a single expedition was really a moving system. A fleet that learned as it traveled. A fleet that paid for itself as it traveled. And a fleet that grew more dangerous with every kilometer. You might be wondering something. How does a fleet of 120 ships travel this far without being stopped? The answer is that it wasn't unseen. People saw them. Villagers saw them. Monks saw them. Towns saw them. Warnings were sent. But information moved slowly. The Vikings moved quickly. Information traveled at the speed of a horse. The Vikings traveled at the speed of the river. By the time one warning reached the next town, the fleet had often moved on. By the time Paris understood what was happening, the Vikings were already approaching the city. And that meant the Franks were about to discover something they had never considered. Reaching Paris was possible. Could Paris survive it? By now, the Vikings had done what many thought impossible. They had reached Paris. But reaching Paris and taking Paris were two different things. The city still had everything that made it formidable. The island, the bridges, the defenders, the king. Everything that had made the Franks feel secure. And that's what makes the next part of the story so remarkable. By now, the Vikings had done what many thought impossible. They had reached Paris. But reaching Paris and taking Paris were two different things. The city still had everything that made it formidable. The island, the bridges, the defenders, the king. Everything that had made the Franks feel secure. And that's what makes the next part of the story so remarkable. Because Ragnar didn't just arrive outside Paris. He arrived at exactly the right moment. Think about what had to happen. 120 ships, thousands of men. A journey of hundreds of kilometers, across the North Sea, up the Seine, deep into enemy territory. And the timing mattered, because that morning was Easter Sunday, the most important day in the Christian calendar. While the Vikings approached the city, Many of the people of Paris were in church, not watching the river, not expecting an attack. And that meant the city's greatest defenses were about to face a threat they had never been designed for. Surprise. The final approach to Paris may have been the most terrifying part of the entire operation, because by the time the city saw the fleet, there was almost nothing left to do. One Frankish chronicler described the river as being so crowded with ships that it appeared covered in oak. That's the moment the scale of the attack became clear. This wasn't a raid. It wasn't a handful of warriors looking for loot. This was an army, and it was already at Paris. The bell began to ring, not because an attack was on the way, but because it had arrived. And while panic spread through the city, Charles the Bald finally moved to stop it. At least, he tried. Charles the Bald's plan made sense. Control both banks of the river, contain the fleet, protect the city. The problem was that the Seine divided his army just as effectively as it divided the Vikings. And Ragnar saw it immediately. Rather than attacking both Frankish forces at once, he struck the weaker one. The battle was brief. The outcome was decisive. Frankish soldiers were captured. And then Ragnar did something that shocked even by the standards of the time. He had 111 prisoners hanged, not hidden away, not out of sight, where the other Frankish army could see them. Imagine standing on the opposite bank, watching, unable to cross, unable to intervene, unable to help. The message was unmistakable. This is what happens to those who resist. Whether it was an offering to Odin, psychological warfare, or both, it worked. The surviving Frankish force did not attack. The momentum belonged entirely to the Vikings now. And with the defenders shaken, Ragnar turned his attention toward Paris. At this point, Paris was in danger. Everyone knew it. The Vikings had reached the city. One Frankish army had already been defeated. The other had been intimidated into inaction. The capital needed protection. And yet, Charles the Bald made a surprising decision. He did not focus his efforts on Paris. Instead, he moved to protect the Abbey of Saint-Denis. To a modern audience, that sounds strange. Why protect a monastery when your capital is under threat? But Saint-Denis wasn't just a monastery. It was one of the most sacred places in the Frankish kingdom. The burial place of kings, a symbol of royal legitimacy, a spiritual heart of the realm. Losing Paris would be humiliating. Losing Saint-Denis would be something worse, at least in the eyes of many contemporaries. So Charles made his choice, and Paris was left largely to fend for itself. Whether that decision was wise is still debated. What isn't debated is the result. The Vikings entered the city, and Paris fell, not after a long siege, not after months of fighting, in a single day. Everything the Franks thought protected the city had failed. The island, the river, the distance, the warning time, all of it. And now Charles faced a new problem. The Vikings had won, but they were still there. And every day they remained inside the kingdom, the danger grew, which left him with only one realistic option. He would have to negotiate. Charles paid them 7,000 pounds of gold and silver, more than 2.5 tons of precious metal. In today's money, the metal alone would be worth several $1 million. But that comparison doesn't really capture what it meant. Imagine what that wealth represented in 845, a time when most people would never own more than a handful of silver coins, a time when kings measured wealth in land, tribute, livestock, and treasure. This wasn't the wealth of a man, or even the wealth of a city. It was the wealth of a kingdom. And Charles handed it over for one reason. He wanted the Vikings gone. The treasure was weighed out, loaded onto wagons, and handed over to the invaders. Imagine the sight. An army arrives from across the sea, sails hundreds of kilometers inland, captures the capital, defeats the king's forces, and then leaves richer than anyone could have imagined. From the Viking perspective, it was an extraordinary success. From the Frankish perspective, it was deeply humiliating. But the real victory wasn't the treasure. It was the lesson. For generations, the Franks had looked at the Seine and seen protection. Now they had seen an enemy fleet use the same river as a path. The illusion was gone. The capital had been reached. The kingdom had been penetrated. And everyone knew it. After 845, every ruler in Western Europe had to live with a new reality. If the Vikings could reach Paris once, what was stopping them from doing it again? The attack shattered more than Frankish defenses. It shattered assumptions. The Franks looked at the Seine and saw safety. The Vikings looked at the same river and saw a possibility. That's the story of the Paris raid. Not superior numbers, not superior weapons. The island that protected Paris, the river that protected Paris, the distance that protected Paris. The Vikings turned all of them into advantages. Whether the man leading the fleet was Ragnar Lothbrok, Ragnar, or someone history has forgotten, one thing is certain. When the bell began to ring on Easter Sunday in 845, the battle for Paris had already been lost. For centuries, people have remembered the raid on Paris as a story about Vikings, about Ragnar, about longships, about treasure. But perhaps that's not what the story is really about, because the Franks and the Vikings were looking at the same landscape, the same river, the same city, the same obstacles, and they saw completely different things. The Franks saw protection, the Vikings saw opportunity. The Franks saw a barrier, the Vikings saw a path. And in the spring of 845, that difference changed history. If you enjoyed this video, consider subscribing to Mind of Viking for more stories from the Viking Age. Thanks for watching.